People who realized they had bad therapists. What were the red flags? I went to an appointment and the door was locked. I waited 15 minutes and called him. No response. He texted me back a few minutes later and said he had the flu and was in bed and sorry he didn't call to cancel. I went to the grocery store instead. I saw him shopping. He ducked when he saw me. I never went back to him. That would be hilarious if I saw it in a movie. But in real life, what the fuck? When he was on the news for banging a client, it was his arrest photo because that's a crime. He was our marriage counselor. And he was married. So was the client. I was 13. The therapist was an older woman who, upon first meeting me, insisted to my mother that I was on drugs. I wasn't, and that clearly my father and or brother were molesting me. My father and brother have never, ever touched me inappropriately. This was one sick bitch who needed help herself. Oof. Too many therapists who work with kids really shouldn't be working with kids. When I was 12, my folks went through a really messy divorce. My brother and I both ended up in foster care for 6 months, kind of messy. I was court ordered to see a therapist for evaluation. I was a 12-year-old with a college reading level. Articulate and certainly old enough everyone felt it was fine for me to skip lunch as well as fifth hour to walk, alone, to her office, 3 times a week. The first session, she gave me naked Barbies and crayons, no paper, just crayons, and told me to play with these things while she watched. She expected me to do this for 45 minutes while she filled out paperwork. She didn't even notice when I took a book out of my backpack to read instead. Then, when I got back to school, I missed a math test so I could eat the cold lunch someone saved for me, which I then had to make up during yet another class. The whole thing just pissed me off and I never remembered to go back for a second session. So I went to child therapy back in the day. But the therapist always had my dad in the room with my sisters and I. Because of that, I was never able to tell her about how he was abusing my sisters and I. I remember every time I answered a question, I'd be looking at him for an okay on the answer. She literally never caught on. Recently started therapy and had about 5 to 6 sessions with the same guy. The last 2 sessions he was either late or had shared some bad news going on in his life, and had multiple uninterrupted rants of 15+ minutes or more where the subject matter was only tangentially related at the absolute best. It wasn't. During those rants, name-dropped public figures in my sphere and told secrets about them. Unprofessional and sloppy. We sat there in silence for a few moments and then he said, "I've been doing coffee enemas, dude." What? That was the last time I saw him. Geez, I'm a therapist and these replies are disturbing. I became resentful to their advice and felt myself digging in against their suggestions. I wouldn't say she was a bad therapist at all, just that our styles clashed. Important that you not only have a good therapist, but one that fits well for you. He told me several times how pretty he thinks I am. He also refused to believe me when I said I think I have PTSD. I definitely had PTSD. Ha ha ha. Oh, this takes me back. She stopped me in the middle of a session to tell me that the real problem was that I made everything about myself, which would have been a valid point, had she not continued like right now. You're just talking about yourself, and about your life. Every week you just talk about yourself. You know, I just had a baby a few months ago, before I ever started going to her, but you never ask me how that's going. You never ask me about my life, or my friends, or my relationship with my husband. If you're like this with everyone in your life, I can imagine why people don't like being around you. I left super ashamed and never went back. When our marriage counselor told us he had been divorced 6 times, I went to see him in emotional distress. At first I thought he was having a bad day. Stifled yawns, staring blankly, needing cues to respond to questions, then asking me to repeat the question. I served him at my place of work 10 years later. He had no idea that he saved my life because I was so angry I complained to the health commissioner, and it gave me a purpose to live to ensure nobody else got that crappy therapy when in dire straits. When I disclosed that I had been sexually assaulted at a party in college, he told me it wasn't real rape because they hadn't tied me up. Made me blame myself for years. Ended up diagnosed with PTSD from the sexual assault over a decade later. Told me I was fine and couldn't have depression/PTSD. Confirmed diagnosis from 3 Drive S and still struggling, because I kept my grades up and that nothing clearly was wrong with me and I was making it up. Even when I disclosed being unable to leave my dorm room for several days at a time and missing class a lot. Insomnia, executive dysfunction, etc. Profs are the real MVPs here, allowing the absences and my sister keeping me alive. Also threatened to report me to police as a violent offender for expressing anger, not even threats or desire to do anything. I was just angry at the person and my whole situation, at the person who caused all the issues. Never trusted a therapist again. Mandated reporting shouldn't be used as a threat to patients you don't want to deal with. Woo for free uni counseling. Ironically, she went to one of my classes to give a seminar about seeking help for depression and suicide after a classmate passed away and listed off all my symptoms. I told her, "Fucking bitch, she's still a therapist too. Fucking up more unsuspecting kids who can't get access to decent healthcare." I was gonna say that sounds exactly like free student counseling. Those guys' top priority is grades, and you can't have any actual problems unless your grades are bad. I remember when I was in a bad place after my dad died, my mom talked to the school counselor. He pulled out all the stops, dug into all his medical training, thought through every possible scenario to get me the best care he could. A week later he found me in the hallway and offered me a high five. Fuck them all. I was 39 and had unearthed my wife's affair only a week previously. Was just a total heartbroken, shattered mess. His recovery plan was to make a man out of me and that video games were for children. He was well into his 70s. Fired. Since remarried, I still play the video games. I'm in my early 30s. Play the hell out of video games whenever I have enough time. Whenever I meet anyone who's trying to discredit video games as a hobby, I stay the fuck away, and somehow it made my circle of friends much healthier. When I asked some of those people about their hobbies, I hardly ever got anything more than watching sports or hanging out in pubs/clubs. PS video games are obviously not my only hobby, just the one that gets most reluctant reactions. The one I went to after my suicide attempt at 16 had some not so compassionate opinions. My very first session, one thing I told her was that I was bullied a lot at school. Her response was, well, suicide attempts are usually done in order to manipulate others. So since you were capable of that, did you ever consider maybe you were the bully? I really never spoke to her again. I had to go weekly because of my attempt, but I just sat in silence every session until I could stop going. Equating my suicide attempt to me being a manipulator after knowing me for probably less than 20 minutes was just, no. Damn, if someone said that to me when I was suicidal, I'd lose my shit immediately. How horrible. That must have been a very bad experience. You gotta be really careful about losing your shit. If you have a history of suicide, then anything that might be interpreted as a temper tantrum, there's a good chance you'll get involuntarily committed. Copying this from another post of mine, when I discussed my depression and anxiety, both relating to chronic medical issues and very little hope for the future, both my own and the planet's, with a new psych, I got told this wonderful line, but what if everyone felt like that? Nothing would get done. Oh really? Thanks. Now I feel more worthless. Not me, but a friend of mine. He was taken to a mental hospital for trying to commit. And when he went to his regular psychiatrist after being in the hospital for a while, she basically told him that if he couldn't guarantee that he'd be alive by the next appointment, she didn't want to work with him, because it was a waste of time and resources and he wouldn't be able to pay her. So he got fired from a psychiatrist for being mentally unwell. Went through a couple of years where I was using Xanax and other drugs. Got a DUI and license taken. Had to go to a drug counselor to get it back. She had a weird shed/building she had converted into an office, so I was already feeling uncomfortable walking into someone's backyard for therapy. Got there for my first session and she immediately offered to get me a Xanax prescription after me telling her my drug history. Thankfully at this point I was already clean and had decided to stay that way. It was definitely a WTF moment, and I'm glad I didn't find her at a time where I would have been weak enough to accept the offer. Fuck that therapist. I have ambiguous feelings about court-ordered substance abuse therapy. On the one hand, I obviously think it is a good thing. It is a way for a judge to provide an offender a way to get their shit together instead of just tossing them in jail and putting charges on their records. On the other, I've seen so many cases where sketchy-ass practitioners basically use it as an easy money revenue streams. If your rates are low, people who can't pay an expensive private therapist have to come to you. This is most of us. And since they have absolutely no choice, they will make every appointment no matter how terrible you are. Rinse and repeat for the next one. He broke confidentiality and told my girlfriend what we talked about in therapy. He is so lucky I didn't report his ass. 2 sessions later, he referred me because my problems were too dark. Fuck that guy. How come you didn't report him? Essentially it started sounding like they were giving answers they wanted to give. It didn't sound like they were saying what was needed. Also they didn't quite understand my complex issue. They gave out solutions and worksheets day 2. Didn't take any time to actually know me. Made me feel like some run-of-the-mill case. It didn't help that their worksheets basically didn't pertain to any of my issues. They were nice, courteous, and genuine, but their guidance was very misplaced. I had a long report written by a psychologist who had given me a thorough assessment. The therapist on the 3rd appointment told me the report was probably wrong and I should just basically try harder. Every session, he asked me if I thought my mood was due to my period. Mine wouldn't really talk to me, reflect, or provide any input. He claimed he wasn't supposed to say anything, that it would be bad for our session. He just stared at me quietly and never really seemed to help or care, no emotion or engagement. I understand this is clinical, I'm not looking for a friend. I left after a few sessions, but the nail in the coffin was when he matched me with me on Tinder and hit me up on apps. I finally told him I was his patient, only a few weeks prior, and he acted all surprised and apologized. Gross dude. I've been through 2 in the last year. I'm a 29M. One told me I was doing everything right and I should be proud of myself. She was out after 3 visits. The second told me there wasn't much he could do for me, but he'd listen if needed to talk. He also wasn't very supportive of trying to live an active lifestyle while still being a parent. He basically said that's what happens when you have kids. You get fat and sit on the couch. He lasted 2 visits. I have not found a replacement. Mental illness runs in my family. When I told my mom at 15 I was feeling depressed, she immediately got me into the doctor who referred me to a therapist. The therapist was not a good fit, to say kindly. She had my mom sit in on my first session and asked me about self-harm. I had been self-harming on a nearly daily basis at this point. I remember looking at my mom, who was sitting there crying, and I straight up lied. I don't remember the rest of the questions, but one of them was if I had recently gotten out of a relationship. I hadn't. She then concluded with telling me that it didn't seem all that bad. She basically told me that being a teenager was rough and to get over it. I went a few more times and then suffered in silence until age 21 when my anxiety got so bad I was having trouble breathing and was put on antidepressants. I still struggled with self-harm and vague suicidal ideation until 2 years ago, when I finally put my fear of therapy aside and found a good therapist. I never got over my teenage troubles because it was major reoccurring depression. I am on a good regime of therapy and medication now and am very adamant about my treatment. I am 29 now and feel like I've lost my entire teenage years in my 20s to depression. I question almost daily how I managed to live this far. When I spilled my whole life story and the therapist told me you need a therapist. Like no shit dude, that's why I came. He admitted that he isn't really a therapist and mostly just deals with medications. His website lists him as a therapist. Early in the pandemic I reached out to a therapist via my work's EAP program. It was over the phone. For those who don't know, EAP therapists, Employee Assistance Program, are for short-term, specific things, and you usually see the therapist within a week of trying to book an appointment. I had seen one prior for 3 sessions who was amazing and helped me get back on track, so I was feeling good about calling and doing a phone session, gave the background info of what I was dealing with, and what I had done to deal with it, and essentially just said I needed to talk out different approaches to the problem and some help navigating what would likely be the best option. She cut the call short by saying this is really stupid to be calling about. You just need to figure it out. I can't help you. And then she hung up on me. And #X200B, additionally my husband had finally gone to see a therapist himself. A friend of his was going to this guy, so he decided he should go there too. After the first few appointments, he always went for a drive before coming home. After the 4th, he came right home, which I thought was odd. So I gently asked what happened. I've no idea what they talked about at the other appointments. And he said they essentially spent the entire session of the therapist talking about how he got into therapy, where he's lived previously, etc. I think the look on my face was enough for my husband to realize he probably shouldn't waste his money going back there. She told me I didn't have autism because I didn't act like her 10-year-old autistic son. Maybe because I'm not a 10-year-old boy?